Okay. So that message for everybody who's just joined, that's because we are recording this so that others will be able to watch this asynchronously and expand our audience. But I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon for session 14.2 at the conference. This is the session on humanitarian crisis at sea, the failure of labor governance to protect seafarers. This is a session that I'm going to thank our organizer, Desiree LeClercq, who put in a lot of work making this session happen. So thank you very much to Desiree for that. And of course, thanks to our Lyra tech support team for making all this virtual conference happen. Thank you to the organizers for that. I'm Alex Colvin. I'm going to be moderating this session, a faculty member and dean here at the ILR School at Cornell University. On our panel today, we have my colleague at Cornell ILR, Desiree LeClercq. We have Brandt Wagner from the ILO, Fabrizio Barcellona from the International Transport Workers Federation, Tim Springett from the UK Chamber of Shipping, Birgit Pauksztat from Uppsala University, and Naim Nazha from Transport Canada. So we have a wonderfully mixed panel from representatives from labor, employer, and government, and from our international agencies, all here to discuss what I think is one of the really important topics that was a major concern arising from this pandemic that I think also we'll see in the panel's discussion illustrated some broader issues around this sector. We're going to, first of all, talk a little about the problem, try and get a sense of the issues that were affecting seafarers during the pandemic, and then try to think about some of the potential solutions there. As we're discussing, at the end, there will be time for some questions. So if you want to put questions into the chat, please do so, and we'll get to those at the end of the discussion. It's going till, the session goes till 3:45, so we'll try and time it with that in mind. So to start off our discussion, I'm going to turn to Fabrizio first. Fabrizio, over the summer, we heard reports of a humanitarian crisis confronting the world's seafarers due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Would you agree with that characterization, and what have you witnessed in your role of supporting seafarers?
Right. Thank you, Alex, and thank you for the invitation, and a good day to all. So I can avoid to say good morning, afternoon, evening, depending where you are. Absolutely, I think you are absolutely right. I think that I recall a little bit earlier this time last year when we started to receive at the ITF about 500 emails a week from seafarers asking what was going on, and then rapidly went to 6,000–7,000 email a week, where seafarers started to get distress, case of anxiety, a lack of hope, showing anger at the situation where they were not able to go back home. It is quite funny how over 7 billion of the world population is dependent on just 1.7 million seafarers for what we need. And I think it was a humanitarian crisis, and at a certain extent still is, and it's very difficult to say, but that is reality. Seafarers' right has been crushed during the past 17 months, and still the world has continued to ask for their services. But a number of countries, if not the majority of countries, have turned their back to seafarers. You have asked to give some example of the extent of the crisis. I can still remember that there were at least 1,000 seafarers stranded in different ports where the ship owner had a charter flight to return those seafarers of their country of origin. And when the plane were on the tarmac waiting for the landing slot in the country where they had to take the seafarers back, those countries that are supposed to protect and support their citizens, they simply deny the landing slot to those planes and simply told it's better that those seafarers stay where they are, because here the situation is not clear. We have had plenty of situations where seafarers fell ill on board of a ship on a non-related COVID issue, needed urgent medical attention, not because of the master wanted to see a doctor, but certainly because there have been telemedicine conversation going on, and those seafarers need urgent care. And the ship where they were on board has been turned back from at least 3 countries before the social partner, which I mean the ITF, ICS, and other stakeholders in the industry, managed through the good office of the ILO and IMO finally to get those seafarers off the ship. And it's very, very, very funny to say that those countries didn't want seafarers to be landed to receive urgent medical attention, but they still wanted the cargo that the ship was carrying. I don't know, I think that we realized that there was a global crisis when following 17 cases of COVID on board of a cruise vessel just outside Australia, immediately 30 countries turn and close their border to cruise vessels. And at the same time, all the passengers on board, they are allowed to return home safely, while the seafarers has been kept on board for over 3 months. And unfortunately, at least 3 seafarers on those vessels couldn't take it anymore and commit suicide. So it is quite clear that the failure of the implementation of the existing regulations that are out there to protect seafarers were simply not adopted, or their implementation being twisted to protect borders and country, while seafarers were completely forgotten. Seafarers that have 3, 4, 5, 6 month contract ended up being on board for over 17, 14, 16 months. And anyone that is aware of the demanding job that is a seafaring can understand how difficult could have been for those seafarers. A recent survey that the ITF has launched, that is still ongoing, have received some 2,500 respondents by now, and it's not the case that a quarter of them they clearly show sign of mental distress, and over 40% they have declared that they are considering seriously to abandon the career at sea because of the uncertainty that lie ahead of them, not knowing when and if they can go back home, and they're considering to switch to another career ashore. So I don't know if this as initial starting point on what I believe it was, and it still is, an humanitarian crisis is sufficient to initiate a debate. But if you feel that I should provide additional example, I would be happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's maybe turn to Birgit to talk a little about your research, where you've been evaluating the effects of the pandemic on seafarers aboard international vessels. And I believe you've also analyzed the effects on their well-being and fatigue. Could you tell us a little about that?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Desiree. We did a survey last summer together with colleagues at the University of Queensland in Australia, together with a colleague in Royal Holloway, London, and a colleague at the World Maritime University in Sweden. And we did an online survey among seafarers who at the time of the survey were on board. So that was kind of special because we were interested in how they're experiencing this situation. And we received responses from over 600 seafarers at the time. And the responses indicated that there was a lot of variation, actually. For some, they said, well, there's not so big effects. It's pretty much business as usual. But for a very large number, they experienced often quite severe effects. and many of the results mirror what Fabrizio just related from his experiences. So 70% of our respondents said that they had experienced severe impacts on just crew changes in particular, that crew changes had been delayed or cancelled, were becoming really unpredictable. And as Fabrizio said, this meant that many of them had been on board for quite a long time. I think in our sample, those who had been on board for longest had been on board for 18 months, so 1.5 years, if you imagine. And that in a situation where it, as Fabrizio already said, they couldn't leave the ship. Many said it was very difficult to get shore leave, to for example, to go shopping for personal supplies. You can imagine after a year on board, you're running short on toiletries, you might need some new clothing. Also for recreation, to see something else than just the same 20 faces you have seen for the last year, to see a different environment, so just for recreation, but also for medical purposes. So some said it was difficult to get prescription medicine. Some said it was difficult or impossible to visit dentists, these medical emergencies. There was a crew member who was pregnant, where they were really worried what they would do if they couldn't get her ashore in time for the birth. So a lot of these ship shore problems which were mentioned, and these were mentioned by about 50% of our respondents. Another element of this was that the crews felt that the rules they had to comply with in the different ports seemed quite arbitrary. So they said even in the same country, each port might have their own rules and their own regulations of what we can do and what we can't do. And some of these rules were difficult to implement. And then they also noticed that some of the shore staff, when they came on board, were quite careless, they thought, and didn't really respect the rules that the crew had on board. So many of the crew members were also afraid of maybe getting infected. So especially the more experienced crew members often felt much more safe at sea than they felt safe in port. Also, what respondents mentioned is that the workload increased. 50% reported higher workloads due to the pandemic, partly related to, for example, more administrative work in connection with port calls, but also, of course, as you can imagine, more work with cleaning and disinfecting. And together with being on board for longer, we could see quite high levels of fatigue. For example, we found that about 40% of the respondents had reported symptoms of fatigue several times, almost every day during the last week. So these are quite high levels of fatigue that you see in the sample. And also we see quite high levels of depression and anxiety. For example, about 30 to 40% of the respondents reported symptoms of depression several times or almost every day during the last week. And over 50% reported symptoms of anxiety at least several times during the last week. So these are some of the results that we found in our survey. Right. And I can put the link to the report in the chat if somebody wants to look up more. We are very limited on time here. So yeah,
it's one of the great features of chat. Yeah, great way to share. Thank you, Birgit. Tim, could we turn to you to get a perspective from the ship owners? How has the crisis impacted ship owners?
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you also for your introduction, and to yourself and my old and dear friend Desiree for inviting me to join this distinguished panel of speakers. I'm here representing the United Kingdom Chamber of Shipping, and we have a diverse membership covering all major shipping trades. And I think the impact of the pandemic has depended on the type of trade that ship owners have been involved in. For cargo operators, keeping supply lines of essential food, fuel, medicines, medical equipment, amongst many other things. Operational has been of the utmost importance. Ship owners have adopted stringent anti-infection procedures aimed at protecting seafarers and preventing the COVID-19 virus coming on board ships. But in the midst of all of this, we've been confronted by all the issues that Fabrizio has referred to so far, and likewise Birgit and many others. We've had borders being closed, quarantine being imposed on seafarers. We've had seafarers being instructed to get a negative test result 72 hours before arriving in a country. And if the flight bringing them in has been delayed so that the test has been 73 hours or more before their arrival, they've been turned back, and that's another crew change that's been cancelled. We've had charterers inserting no crew changes clauses into charter parties. We've seen ship owners with sick and injured crew members on board finding coastal states not willing to let them off their ships to go to hospital. Sometimes we've seen ship owners diverting, in some cases, thousands of nautical miles, quite literally, in order to carry out crew changes or to find states that are willing to accept seafarers who need hospital treatment. We've had ship owners going to enormous expense to charter aeroplanes to ensure that crew changes can take place, because the commercial airlines haven't been operating where we've needed them. And just to add insult to injury, we've had some coastal states trying to detain ships on the grounds that crew members have been on too long. Now, having said all of that, there has been a very effective coalition of interests led by our international umbrella organization, the International Chamber of Shipping, with strong support and cooperation from the ITF, the World Health Organization, the IMO, the ILO, and regional organizations to keep supply lines functioning and protect the health and welfare of seafarers. And I would like, if I may, to take this opportunity to thank Fabrizio and Brandt and their colleagues for this outstanding collaborative effort, because I think it has, the situation for seafarers and for the shipping industry would have been considerably worse, if that's even imaginable, had we not cooperated as well as we have done and continue to do. Now, looking at operators of passenger services, the picture's been very different. Restrictions on travel have caused ferry operators to take a huge hit, whilst the cruising sector has been almost entirely shut down, and it's only now taking its first baby steps towards restarting activity. Initially, when the pandemic was declared and countries started closing borders, the issue was getting crew members home. At one stage, I think Fabrizio mentioned this, some countries were refusing to allow their own nationals to return, which is a quite unprecedented situation and wholly against key principles of international law. Meanwhile, we found that job support schemes or furlough programs have not always been available to shipping companies. So with no income, they've had to dig deep to ensure that they can retain staff and be ready for the restart that is just commencing now. So I think we can see as rather like Fabrizio said, the world depends on ships and the seafarers that operate them for international trade, for the supply of essential goods, and the impact has been very serious, and it's put the survival of some sectors at serious risk.
Thanks, Tim. Naim, let's turn to you. Canada's been incredibly active in the global shipping industry. How's the crisis impacted the government, in particular your port-state relationships and responsibilities?
Thank you, Alex, for you and for Desiree for inviting us today at this session of LIRA. To elaborate more from a little bit what Fabrizio and Tim just alluded to, as being a member of the Maritime Authority in Canada and being at Transport Canada, the government we have taken an approach where we have designated the seafarers as essential workers. What that translated into is to ensure that the transportation mode in the maritime mode is not broken, basically, to ensure that the goods continue to flow, whether domestically or internationally. And that at the same time has allowed the seafarers to be able to take shore leave, to be able to take medical requirement, and what have you. So by designating them as essential workers has put them in a family, if you want, in a scope of people that have some of these restrictions that have been put on others like us, normally have been removed. So, and we have also worked to address also some of the issues that Fabrizio touched on, like the repatriation, long time being on board, the Seafarers employment agreement have not been respected, and so forth. So at least in Canada, unlike other countries, maybe we have worked closely with other departments and other government departments like the Immigration Canada, like Border Services, where we have facilitated the acquisition of visas for certain seafarers that requested visa, for example, to fly over to be able to do the crew exchange and and landing at different ports, and together with other members of the EU and south of the border with the United States, for example. So these procedures were put in place to facilitate exactly that and to ensure, as Canada is signatory to this international standard for the protection of seafarers, what is known as the Maritime Labor Convention. So we have an obligation. So we wanted to ensure that those obligations are always respected, whether ships are coming to Canada, leaving Canada, and domestically. And during this episode, Canada is also a member of what we call a regional MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, on the Atlantic side with the Paris member countries, and on the Asia Pacific side with the Tokyo, or the what we call the Tokyo Memorandum of Understanding, that represent the Asia Pacific countries. So among these countries, these regional MOUs, we did ensure, between all of us, these countries that are members, to ensure that these, if you want, these international standards had been respected. We have facilitated the repatriation of seafarers. We have ensured that at least the requirement under this international obligation, those international obligations have been respected by member authorities and by ship owners and manning agencies. So I would say to that effect, we have worked also, at least in Canada, closely with the organization represented by Fabrizio here, the ITF, where, for example, the ITF will reach out to us where they have, I would say, they know of complaint on board vessel. Then our inspectors will board the vessel and will verify and will take action as required. So I think there was a good leadership and I guess working relation with all government entities within Canada and with the representatives of the ship owners and of the seafarers in ensuring that at least this important the family of seafarers are really protected, to ensure that at least the supply chain and the mode of transport, the maritime mode, is not broken, and they continue to deserve what the right of the protection and so forth. So I think, in general, we did work well. We also, for example, follow up with the United States Coast Guard. Unlike Canada, for example, in the US is not yet party to this international standard. They are still party to a previous international standard called ILO 148, that's the standard. So we did work with the US Coast Guard to ensure at least if vessels have been highlighted or done in Canada and they are going to the United States, to ensure that with the US Coast Guard they are taking the proper action to ensure at least the group of seafarers that are needed to exchange or to leave, at least they have been facilitated the repatriation, and the crew replacement have been boarded. I think so. There was with the parameters of the pandemics, we have put in place the measure to ensure that at least this part of the family we call the seafarers have been protected as we speak. Thank you.
Thanks. Turning to the ILO's role, Brandt, what type of assistance has the ILO's member states and seafarer organizations been requesting of the ILO to address the crisis?
Yeah, well, thanks, Alex, everybody on the panel, people watching. First, I should say what the ILO is. The ILO is a United Nations specialized agency. And our job is to promote decent work for all. And we are special because we have a tripartite structure. Governments, workers, employers, representatives all have a voice and vote. We are a normative-based organization, which means we adopt international labor standards. Of those, the most important are conventions, And a convention, once it's adopted by a state, well, it's adopted by the ILO, ratified by a state, enters into force, then it creates a binding obligation on the state. And we have a system in place to make sure that states, to work with states to make sure they fully comply with the conventions they ratify. Now, going back to that, now people talked, many of the presenters here talked about the Maritime Labor Convention. Well, this is our biggest convention. It's not only the biggest convention for seafarers, it's the biggest convention in the ILO. Why? Because seafarers are international workers. So this convention, adopted 15 years ago, sets out many rights for seafarers. It's called the Seafarers Bill of Rights by many. And this includes it covers many of the issues that were discussed by the previous speakers. For example, repatriation, the right to get home and have the ship owner pay for it. Employment agreements, making sure that everybody has an employment agreement and it has a certain termination date. Hours of work and rest, occupational safety and health, medical care at sea, access to medical care ashore, which is essential, and many other issues. Now, when the pandemic broke out, the ILO was approached by the ship owners and seafarers organizations, like Fabrizio referred to this, and they said many states are not fully applying the convention. They're not delivering the rights that seafarers have under the convention. So the ILO approached those states. We reminded them of their obligations under the conventions, under the Maritime Labor Convention, and asked them to basically address the issue. We were also approached by governments themselves, and they said, this is, what are we going to do? Here we are in the pandemic, things are not operating as usual, and what do we do? So when it comes to applying the convention, so the ILO, the Secretariat, working with ship owners and seafarers organizations, we developed a very strong information note that described how to deal with this. Now, initially, in the first stages of the pandemic, there was a lot of flexibility. But as the pandemic went on, it was realized this is no longer a surprise situation. It's no longer an unpredictable situation. So there was a lot of stress to really fully apply the convention, to have it really to go back to making sure these standards were in place. So and applied. So the convention actually served as a tool to pressure states, governments, to do this. Now, the problem was somewhat caused by governments. Caused by the pandemic, but caused by governments, health authorities, trying to do in the best interest of their countries to protect people, right? But at the same time, unfortunately, doing a different disservice to the seafarers. So the ILO has done this. We were able, in the last time we revised this information note in February, to take into account the comments of our supervisory bodies, which had reviewed what states were doing in COVID, and also the comments of ship owners and seafarers on the situation Fabrizio and Tim have explained. And there was deep concern expressed over the situation, urgent call to protect seafarers' rights, even raising the specter of possible forced labor situations. So this has been a valuable tool. Now, we've adopted, the ILO governing body has adopted resolutions on this. And as has been mentioned, we work very closely with the International Maritime Organization, other parts of the UN system, ICS, ITF, et cetera, to deal with the problem. And most recently in April, the Special Tripartite Committee of the Maritime Labor Convention, which reviews what's happening with the convention every 2 or 3 years. We discussed the convention, we discussed this issue, and they made certain recommendations on how to deal with the problem, including recommendations on getting access by seafarers to vaccinations.
Thanks. I think this is giving us this sense of both the severity and the global nature of this crisis. I want to turn our conversation a little more towards the question of solutions, policy approaches that we could be taking. Desiree, what type of legal changes do you think could be considered to better enforce the seafarer protections?
Thanks, Alex. And once again, thanks to my friends, old and new, for coming and joining us in this endeavor. As Brandt has mentioned, the ILO has a convention that's directly on point. It's the Maritime Labor Convention, which is a relatively young convention for the ILO. It was adopted in 2006, but it didn't go into effect until 2013. It had, and there are many objectives to the MLC, but I'll just give 3. One of the objectives was to consolidate and update all of the various standards so that seafarers did not face a patchwork of different legal regulations. Another was to strengthen those standards to combat seafarer fatigue. And another was to adopt over the IMO's no more favorable status so that it could kind of help incentivize a global enforcement. As you've all heard though from the various interventions, those three objectives are not being satisfied right now, right? So we have, as Birgit mentioned, seafarers are complaining that they're facing various different regulations, even amongst or across ports in the same country. Massive statistics about seafarer fatigue, and something that I'm going to focus on a little bit, a lack of enforcement. And in particular, a lack of enforcement by port states. So something that the Maritime Labor Convention does that has not really been done in other instruments is it gives affirmative legal obligations on the port states. So up until now, under maritime law, most of the affirmative obligations were on flag states, right? They had to do specific things in order to get certified. The Maritime Labor Convention introduced new obligations for port states. They said specifically under standard A251, paragraph 7, for those of you paying attention, that port states had an affirmative obligation to facilitate repatriation. And this is one of the biggest areas during the pandemic that port states have simply not satisfied their obligation. Looking at the Maritime Labor Convention, it has a bifurcated system of enforcement. And what I mean is when flag states neglect their obligations under the Maritime Labor Convention, they are subject to enforcement by port states. And port states can do a lot of things, including financial types of sanctions, right? So flag states that are disobedient really face this dissuasive financial penalty. Port states that fail to satisfy their new affirmative obligation only face supervision by the ILO supervisory bodies. Brandt, this is not to knock the ILO supervisory bodies, but there is no financial equivalent. There's no sanctioning mechanism. So in other words, port states have a new affirmative obligation under the Maritime Labor Convention, but they don't face the same type of enforcement mechanism as do flag states under port state control. All to say that the Maritime Labor Convention was designed with great ambitions in mind, but COVID has really highlighted specific areas where the grand ambitions of the Maritime Labor Conventions have really not helped the seafarers. So one question I'd have, whether it's for the ILO or for the rest of you, is can we envision a system in which port states are supervised and enforced by other port states? One thing that I've been thinking about is the United States system of inspection, and more particularly the International Port Security Program that the United States has, where the US Coast Guard visits and inspects foreign ports for compliance. Where those ports are significantly out of compliance with the IMO's ISPS code or with other standards, if vessels have passed through those disobedient ports amongst the last 5 visits, they could be refused entry into the United States ports. So the US has actually, the US has not ratified the Maritime Labor Convention, and it should, and it's horrible that it hasn't. But that being said, the United States has still introduced an interesting system of compliance that perhaps could be viewed as a model by the ILO in how to strengthen the enforcement of port state obligations.
Thanks, Desiree. So some thoughts there for the ILO. Brandt, what do you think of that? And is the ILO considering any amendments to the MLC?
Okay, well, first, as Desiree said, under the MLC, there's many obligations by port states. Things I mentioned already: access to medical care, assisting, facilitating repatriation, dealing with abandonment cases. There's a sort of an obligation or something that they should do if a flag state doesn't do its job, providing welfare facilities for seafarers, allowing access to leave ashore, having a complaint mechanism in place where seafarers who want to complain, they can make a complaint ashore, and it has to be investigated by the port state. And as she mentioned, we have port state control. Port state control is when a foreign ship comes into your port, and you can check it. Once you've ratified the convention, you can inspect that ship to see if it complies with the MLC. So this is a valuable tool. It actually puts a lot of pressure on. Naim is here, and he can tell you a lot because he's very experienced in the port state control community. So, I mean, the thing about port state control in the COVID situation, which is a bit tricky, is that in many cases, a port state would go to look, for example, on board a vessel and say, okay, let me see the seafarer, the medical certificates, for example, are they expired? And because of the situation of the pandemic, many flag states also provided exemptions. They said, we'll give you an exemption during this period because this is difficult. So the port state really in many ways has to honor that. If they have a complaint, because if the ship owner, for example, if you go to detain a ship, the ship owner is actually complying with the law of the flag state. So this is something we have to remember. But now, if we look at what could be done to strengthen port state control, well, on amendments in the MLC has been amended 3 times already. Next in October, well, we're going to have a meeting next April to look at possible amendments to the MLC. Amendments have to be proposed by governments, ship owners, or seafarers. ILO Secretariat can't do it. Those amendments are due in October. And so far, we haven't seen any amendments specifically addressed at port state control. We understand France is looking at something about time on board vessels. We understand Australia is looking at something on collecting information on suicides. Unfortunately, the situation that's arisen due to COVID. We understand China and perhaps the Seafarers organizations, Fabrizio can tell you what they're thinking about on this. But when we look at the port state control, I mean, the port states are asked, I mean, when people do submit their reports to the ILO on how they implemented the convention, the ILO supervisory bodies do ask questions about port state control and what they do. But port state, I mean, it's not as much as the emphasis on flag state control. So maybe there's room for improvement. As for being inspected, like the way she mentioned about somebody inspecting, going to the individual ports to do it, it's a resource issue as well. But I think Naim will tell you that within the port state control regional agreements, they do this kind of check as a way to determine who can join their agreements. And they actually check out port state control authorities before letting them join these agreements that share information on port state control. Thank you.
Naim, from the port state perspective, you're in a difficult position because you have these international obligations around things like allowing seafarer disembarkment, but you've also got your national obligations to protect your citizens from national security or health threats. Do you see a way around these conflicting demands and obligations, or is sort of the crisis that you face almost inevitable?
Well, thanks, Alex. Having heard Desiree and the ILO Brandt, I think I must say that I tend to disagree a little bit with what Desiree has alluded to in terms of responsibility under the port state, because any instrument that is adopted internationally, it is the responsibility really of, okay, I don't know whether now the audience understand the nuance between flag state, port state, but the implementation of any international standard rests with the flag state primarily. And this is an approach we have been taking for many years. Now, in this case, the port state has the obligation definitely, and it is set in each national regulation of a country that is signatory to a center standard like this one. Canada is signatory to the Maritime Labor Convention, or this labor standard that Brandt alluded to. Definitely we have obligation. However, what is also need to be recognized of is that the documentation of the vessel, if vessel has a certificate, these certificates are a prima facie evidence that they do, the labor standards are being complied with. So we have to be careful here while we are talking about a port state control implementing a standard. We need also to be cognizant that at the same time that we are not delaying, a ship from doing its trade and moving between ports freely. What we have done in the COVID-19 pandemic, for sure, at least I'm talking here in terms of Canada and what we have implemented. And me, myself, as Ben said, I'm the vice chair of the Paris MOU committee. So I'm very involved in the port state implementation of these things, whether on the Canada, on the Atlantic side or on the Pacific side. So we have taken a pragmatic approach. So what it means, as I also mentioned in my early intervention, we did work with the ITF. So for example, if the ship has not been targeted for an inspection, because we are working as a risk on the risk matrix to board vessel or not. However, the ITF has boarded and have reason to believe that there's some issues there. So the ITF will call on the port state, in this case Canada, and we will send people to board and do the inspection, which we have done throughout this year, and we continue to do that. What we need to emphasize though is because of this pandemic, it's a worldwide issue. For example, we came across where we found some issues in repatriation, where we wanted to repatriate the crew of a vessel. However, their country of origin did not have a flight to bring them back, right? For example, in the Asia Pacific area. So the crew will have to leave to that country, but yet there is no regular flight for them to be able to board a connection flight to go back to that country. And that is because that country put one flight a week, and as you may know, there are priorities who board that flight and what have you. So these are some of the issues we have worked on as a port state, as a coastal state with the very vessel that came across. Now, also in your part of your question was related to the domestic side. What if, so by designating the seafarers as an essential workers, we did work at a different level of government, whether at the provincial side, like in your case would be the state side, whether at the municipal side, with the cities, to make sure that those seafarers, when they are in their ports, and those ports are in those cities and what have you, they have the facility to get off the ship, move to within the 3 hours to a shore leave, have medical access and what have you. So those measures were put in Canada. And I go back to the point that we need to be definitely, the pandemic has created some wide international issues, and we were able to, at least in Canada, to work across these things with the ship owners and the seafarers alike to ensure at least that we maintain our obligation of protecting the seafarers and his rights and his or her rights, right, in working on board ships.
Thanks. Fabrizio, let's hear from the seafarers' perspective. What do you think, what kinds of changes do you think need to be made to ensure that both port states and flag states respect the rights of seafarers, despite emergencies or force majeure that we face?
Okay, thank you, Alex. I think that what Naim was saying is to a certain extent absolutely right. I think that what we have witnessed during the past 15 months is not so much the maritime side of the different country administration putting barrier, but the lack of communication with the other agencies within the government. I'll give you an example without naming the country, but a kind of leading country in maritime, where we applaud the port state control, because after visiting the ships, I told the ship owner, these seafarers cannot go on the ship anymore. They've been beyond their contract. So the ship is not leaving unless you replace these seafarers. And so we all collectively, seafarers and ship owner, applauded this position taken by this port state control. And in the same administration, then the immigration told the ship owner, you cannot change, you cannot replace your seafarers here. So the two agencies within the government, they contradict each other. This country is signatory to the Maritime Labour Convention. And so the seafarers and ship owner, they were left with no alternative, and only following, I think, 10 days long negotiation was possible to find a solution. That was about one ship. So you can imagine, you multiply the same issue for, I don't know, 150 countries and 60,000 ships, you have the extent of the issue. But just to go back to your question, there are the Maritime Labour Convention, as it is the perfect instrument if it is implemented accordingly to resolve all the issues we have been talking for the past 15 months. Certainly, as a seafarer side, we will put forward some amendment, but not necessarily in respect of the issue encountered during the pandemic, but because the convention itself allow for filling the gap, improving the convention on certain issues. But as Brandt alluded, everything is there. What is the fundamental problem is its implementation. Countries have unilaterally taken the position invoking the force majeure, but no one has looked from the perspective of the seafarers if the force majeure was also applicable to them, for example, because they were prevented to and after being on board for forever and being tired to perform their job. So I think that the obligation that the ratifying countries of the convention have has been largely ignored. And I think that only the implementation, the full implementation of the convention can address the issue. I know it might be a simplistic way to look at it, but it is, the instrument is there. We don't have to create anything in addition to it, but just implement what we have available.
All right, thanks. Let me turn to Tim again to understand how ship owners are thinking about these issues. Shippers are under these unique pressures where they have to follow schedules, make deliveries on time, hope that port states will allow disembarkment. What do you think needs to change to ensure that shipholders are not held responsible for failures in this?
It's a very real danger. And if you look at the MLC, it's very strongly focused on what ship owners need to do. Article 2 makes reference to duties and responsibilities imposed on ship owners by the MLC. I have no problem with that. The ship owners group accepted the imposition of these responsibilities and duties. They accepted and in fact strongly advocated the application of minimum standards in order that those ship owners who regrettably did not pay sufficient regard to the welfare and the safety of their crews did run into difficulties when attempting to trade. And it meant that there was a strong business case in terms of compliance for those ship owners that conformed to at least to the minimum standards that are set out in the MLC. So we welcome that. But where are the corresponding duties on flag states and port states and labour supply states to ensure that seafarers, that ship owners are able to fulfil what they're required to do? We did an exercise within ICS to see where are the provisions in the MLC that actually put a duty on port states to facilitate the provision by ship owners of seafarers' rights. Now, one example is that coastal states shall allow access to hospitals ashore for seafarers who are in need of emergency medical treatment or essential dental treatment. So there's a specific obligation, and that was being breached. So for many of the rest of the convention's provisions, the obligation is all on the ship owner. There's nothing, no parallel obligation on the port states, the coastal states, the flag states, the labour supply states to actually enable it to happen. Repatriation, the sections on repatriation, there's one line in standard A51, I think it is, that talks about the duty of the port state not to obstruct repatriation, to allow free passage. Nothing about ensuring that the seafarers can disembark from the ship. So the convention went, when you look at it against the background of the pandemic, it starts to appear a bit unbalanced. Now, obviously, back in 2006, when the MLC was adopted, nobody gave a moment's thought to how it would operate in the midst of a global pandemic. However, all governments need to recognize that a global convention that is intended to guarantee the welfare of seafarers is not something that can be complied with only in the good times. It applies all the time. And when we talk about possible amendments to the MLC, part 2 of the fourth session of the Special Tripartite Committee, I'd be very concerned if the response to the pandemic involved a plethora of amendment proposals that increased the duty on ship owners or increased the enforcement of rights on ship owners without any recognition that seafarers actually depend upon the cooperation of states in order to meet their own obligations. Now, when the MLC was adopted, I was in the Salle du Conseil, or in the Palais des Nations of Geneva. At the time, there were 314 votes in favor and not a single vote against. And what that means is that there is genuinely tripartite ownership of the MLC. Now, we can be proud of that, and we should be proud of that. And but ship owners would be roundly condemned if they failed to live up to what we have signed up to, and rightly so. So why should it be any different for governments? I think Fabrizio has made the excellent point that the MLC isn't just for the maritime administration in each ratifying country, it's for all branches of government. There's been quite a strong focus on the health departments, on the sort of national, the interior departments, the border control. They've all got their part to play in making sure that that the MLC functions the way it's intended to when a state has ratified it. I welcome initiatives such as the Neptune Declaration, which did a good job in raising the profile of the need for seafarers to be recognised and treated as key workers, and for crew changes to be facilitated. And I think it was good that there was the major multinational manufacturers were targeted there, because they're the biggest charterers of ships. I think with regard to the FOUL Convention, as Naim has mentioned, it's a very good point. That's a convention that's all about the facilitation of trade. Is there really enough there to put the focus on the people who are operating the ships that are enabling the trade routes to function? I wonder about that. I think that's to a large extent the MLC's role. And I do get concerned, as others have said, when people talk about stronger enforcement, which to me means more ship detentions, more penalties against ship owners. I'm a visiting lecturer at the International Training Center in Turin, where we operate courses for flag state and port state inspectors on the MLC. And every time I'm there, I say, if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from what I've said, forget everything else I've said already. Just remember these two words: promote compliance, because that's what we should be about. Article 1, paragraph 2 of the MLC puts a duty on members to cooperate with each other to ensure that the MLC functions properly. How many governments are even aware of that? How many of them read the articles? How many of them just read the regulations and the code and think, what laws have we got to make to whip these ship owners into line? I leave you with that thought. Perhaps the tools that we need are already there, and we just need all the owners, particularly the governments and every arm, every branch of those governments, to recognise what it is that that they've signed up to. My own country, for example, the United Kingdom, is a major flag state, it's a major port state, and it's a major labour supply state. There are lots of other countries in a similar position. There are others that are predominantly labour supply states, others that are major flag states, too small to have many ports and not having the population for to be significant labour supply states. But we all have an interest, and the tripartite ownership and the importance of promoting compliance, not looking at, not using the MLC as a stick, to beat ship owners with, but actually helping them, because they do want to comply. Certainly the ones that I represent and the ones that the ICS represents. We don't want to be taking the rap for the diminishing number of bad ship owners who gradually are being driven out of our seas because they're not able to comply with global standards. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Birgit, can I turn back to you? Your research, you were surveying seafarers. Was there any one thing that they consistently requested? And what do you think might supplement maritime governance to better protect the seafarers in the future?
Yes, I think the one thing that was top of the list for seafarers was, not surprisingly, just get crew changes organized, basically get it done, quite simply, because that was seen as the root cause for everything else, and what that was really on top of the list. Apart from that, the wish list included a lot of things that referred to basically alleviating the situation on board and to alleviating the situation for the families. So support for families at home, making sure that they are provided for, but also helping seafarers on board, for example, by making it easy to get supplies, by getting a shore leave and so on. One of the things that was also really, really, really important was internet access and communication. This was important both to enable crew members to contact their families, which was a really important source of support for them during this time. But of course, internet also made it possible for them to access other types of support available, for example, to have contact to ITF inspectors, to contact welfare organizations, to contact the ship owner, the shipping companies and so on, but also to keep informed about the pandemic and also for entertainment. So internet was really important. And some of our respondents actually noted really, really favorably that their shipping company had made internet free for them while during this pandemic. So this was something that was really appreciated. What we also saw in our analysis was, and we were actually surprised by the strength of this effect, but external support was really, really important. And this was support by the family, but especially from the shipping company. So there was quite some variation between shipping companies. Some were really, really good at supporting their crews. Other were less good at that, but having a shipping company that you felt supported by really alleviated a lot of the mental health problems and also a lot of the exhaustion on board. So taking a more long-term perspective, might be something to learn from this pandemic is perhaps to see how you could make the shipping companies resilient so that in such crisis in the future, they might step in and have support available, which of course is difficult because in the crisis, as we know, all the support structures also were in trouble. People had to work from home and so on. So this the shore organizations weren't in the best position either. Another thing that we saw that really helped seafarers was to have supportive relations among the crew on board, so have a resilient crew. And I think investing in this, having a long-term perspective on crewing and on crew development, career opportunities for your crews might be a really important thing for shipping companies to consider in the future. And many of them are already doing this, but not all. And this might involve, for example, having permanent contracts instead of very short contracts so that people have a long-term perspective where they actually feel they want to invest in the company, but also maybe think about rest hours. And this maybe has also MLC implications, maybe about, at the moment, many report that they just work and sleep when they are on board. So rest hours are just for sleeping, which means there's no time to actually have interaction with other crew members during leisure time when you can build these supportive relationships. So rest hours may perhaps need a rethink. Another thing that might need a rethink is the maximum time that seafarers are allowed to be on board by MLC conventions at the moment. I think it's 11 or 12 months, which what is this based on? It seems a bit arbitrary. So I think there's a lot of potential there to rethink and sharpen the tools that you mentioned already exist to make them even better in the future.
Great. Thanks, Birgit. And we're almost at the end of our time, but I'm going to note there's been an interesting discussion going on in the chat. So if you haven't been taking a look at the chat, there's been some interesting comments there, including we just had a comment from Kelly Pike that I'll just relate along, that there's some interesting parallels between the discussion going on here and the discussions around labor regulation, global supply chains, interesting debates around Nike and the responses there. So I think there's some fascinating parallels to this discussion. One of the things that's really striking striking about this discussion, the fascinating comments from this excellent panel, is that this is an incredibly important global industry that has often gone underappreciated and under-recognized, the importance of it. We had, I think, glimmerings during the pandemic of a recognition of its importance, both in the early days of cruise ships where there were outbreaks, but then through the week that suddenly it seemed half the world had become experts on how to get a container ship unstuck from the Suez Canal. Maybe, hopefully, this panel will inspire recognition that it's equally important to come up with ways of also figuring out how to improve the lives of seafarers who do this incredibly important work and were some of the groups that most suffered under the pandemic and the impact on their industry. I want to thank everybody on this panel for their wonderful comments, and I do hope that this raises some attention to this issue, particularly in the United States where this conference is being based out, and I hope policymakers in the United States will pay attention to this incredibly important issue. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Great discussion.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now I think we have to pop off so the next panel can come.
Yeah,
Thank you
okay.
all so much for doing this and for giving your diverse